Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to yet more Warhammer lore. Something simple today. We're going to be looking at the High King's bodyguard, the Hammerers. Fuzzy little creatures with magnificent beards and very, very heavy sticks. How could it get any better? Well, one way of improving their aesthetics might be to slap a butt-ton of armor onto them, and so the dwarves did. And now we have the modern-day Hammerer. Clad head to toe in heavy armor and wielding a massive two-handed hammer, this bodyguard of dwarven kings, and by the way, they are technically seen as the bodyguard of the High King, but the dwarves of course have many kings. The High King is special because he gets to put high in front of his title, but many other kings also maintain corps of hammerers as their personal bodyguards. There may be some exceptions, but generally speaking, the Hammerers is considered to be a ceremonial and traditional bodyguard, and the dwarves are nothing if not traditional. As you can probably already imagine, the primary duties of a hammerer consist of getting in the way of anything that might inflict harm on his liege lord. Be that pointy sticks, blunt objects, or heavy things falling from the sky, the hammerer is expected to put himself between them and his boss. It might seem like a thankless task, and indeed if you do end up getting your brains bashed out by a heavy falling piece of masonry to protect your liege lord, it might seem so, but to a dwarf it is an extremely honourable assignment. To have the life of one's lord put into one's hand is a considerable and glorious task. As such, any dwarven clans that can point to an ancestor who served in the king's own hammerers can be expected to take a fair amount of pride in this achievement, and they can also be expected to never ever shut up about it. It's not all glories and rosebuds, however. It is a fairly weighty responsibility, and again, they are expected to get in the way of any potentially fatal objects headed for their lord. It does also entail a fairly considerable oath, and if you know anything about the dwarves, you will know that they take oaths rather seriously. This one in particular is one that binds the hammerer to the liege lord for the rest of his life. Essentially, there is no getting out of the hammerer's core, but then again, dwarves do not grow old like we do. They can remain strong and uppity for a very, very long time, and very, very few dwarves get to live that long in these days. More than likely, any prospective hammerer is going to be ending up dead in a battle somewhere. Not to mention, of course, the fact that he's quite likely to end up dead long before he becomes a hammerer, as hammerers are only selected amongst the best fighters of a king's armies, which means he's probably gotten stabbed at by greenskins a couple times already. Assuming, however, that the dwarf is still alive and comes to the notice of the king, he will be given, at the king's expense, not only the two-handed warhammer, that of course signifies his new rank, status, and responsibilities, he will also be equipped, once again on the lord's own dime, with a magnificent suit of Grumril armor, which is going to keep him safe from most things that would like to stab him. Such a suit of armor is an extravagance, to say the absolute least. Grumril is rare as all hell, and a full suit of armor, including a ringmail, is expensive, shall we just say. However, for a formation like the Hammerers that are expected to be in the thick of the fighting and, once again, get in the way of anything potentially fatal going for their lord, solid armor is pretty damn important, and since using a shield with that giant two-handed hammer is going to be somewhat problematic, they do rely upon that armor far more than most forces do. And of course, as you can probably figure out yourself, armor is particularly useful for someone wielding a two-handed weapon. The two-handed hammer is fairly long, as such it can be used in a marginal defensive capacity, kind of like a quarterstaff. You could certainly parry and block some attacks with this weapon, but you don't really want to either, since that means that something sharp is uncomfortably close to your fingers. Granted, they are still plated fingers, but, well, axes. Additionally, the art of fighting with a two-handed hammer is quite different from fighting with most two-handed weapons. A two-handed sword, for example, has far more flexibility and finesse to it. You still have a long cutting edge, the weapon itself can be used as a defensive tool, and of course it still has a point at the end, which means that it can quite easily be used as a stabbing weapon. A two-handed hammer, on the other hand, is a fairly specific weapon. Pretty much all of the killing power comes from the sheer weight of the hammer's head, and to make the most of this, you need a gravity-assisted movement, or to put it simply, hammer goes up, hammer goes down. And if the wielder wants to do anything with more finesse than that, he is going to have to rely primarily on his own strength, not only to get the weapon and control the weapon, but also to deliver enough killing force with the weapon to incapacitate an opponent. This naturally limits the dwarves' repertoire when it comes to attacks, and can put him at a severe disadvantage against an opponent who has either survived long enough to figure out that hammer goes up, hammer goes down, or if he's fighting against someone who's fought against people using two-handed hammers before. Again, this is where the armor comes in. In fact, it is mentioned in a few of the sourcebooks that hammers often like to bait their opponents in, the hammer having a relatively limited range and a relatively limited range of maneuvers needs to position the enemy just right for a killing blow. The hammers like to present what appears to be a vulnerability, taking an attack directly on their armor. Usually this is done by the hammerer exposing a weakness, for example lifting his arm to strike, presenting the relatively weak armor underneath the armpit, usually just covered by chainmail. Granted, still grumrill chainmail, but considerably softer than plate, waiting for his opponent to take the bait and swing or stab at that, then quickly lowering his arm to take the hit on the shoulder pad, which is a solid piece of grumrill metal, which is likely to take pretty much anything the Warhammer world can throw at it, and now, with the hammerhead in a high position, he can use the weight of the hammerhead to aid his downward swing, as in this case, hammer goes down and then hammer goes up, right between the enemy's legs, for example. And while granted, having one's family jewel smashed to tiny little pieces by a warhammer might not necessarily be a fatal wound, I doubt you'll find a man that could argue that it's not an incapacitating one. But this, of course, is in reference to one-on-one actions. The hammerers fight, of course, as a bodyguard detail, and generally speaking, they don't want to be getting into one-on-one fights because, well, one-on-one fights are fair, and you generally don't want to get into fair fights when your life is at stake, and secondly, they want to maintain formation with their liege lord in the middle to make sure that the silly little bastard doesn't get his skull caved in by an orc club. And in a tight formation, the two-handed warhammer is used very differently. It is used almost like a Roman legion, in fact, where you have ranks of stabbing objects, although in this case it would be slashing objects. The dwarves will be standing with their shoulders pointed towards the enemy. They will be doing this to allow the maximum amount of hammers to be facing a single opponent. If everything goes correctly, they will have two hammers fighting a single enemy, as their formation will be far denser than that of the enemy. And in this case, the individual dwarves will be using a overhead slash straight down, and they will be trying to time this so that one dwarf will swing while the other dwarf is recovering, presenting a constantly bludgeoning little machine of heavily armored dwarf warriors that can be quite nasty to get through. Additionally, it does provide a considerable amount of defense against weapons that might have a longer range. For example, you might think that a spear formation would be rather useful against this. However, the dwarves are pretty much always presenting their heaviest armored parts towards the enemy. Their thick shoulder guards, the curved side of their equally, if not even thicker chest guards, and their heavily armored front legs. It really is a pretty intimidating formation if you imagine it in your mind's eye. You essentially have a solid line of dwarves steadily advancing as they're hammering their weapons down into the ground in front of them, threatening to just simply bludgeon anything that gets in their way, and then just stepping over the now flattened corpses. And it's precisely the kind of formation that the dwarves excel in. Dwarves are extremely tough, and they are extremely durable. A dwarf warrior can fight in grumrill armor while swinging this heavy-ass hammer for a very, very long time, whereas this formation would be entirely impractical for humans. Imagine a human in full plate armor constantly having to swing a heavy two-handed hammer. You'd be lucky if you could fight for 10 minutes straight, and that's being fucking optimistic. Hell, this can be one of those try-it-at-home kids moments. Just strap 20 to 30 kilograms of scrap metal onto your body, and then go find yourself a nice big fat mallet, and then start doing overhead swings for 20 minutes or so. If nothing else, it'd be a damn good workout. But the duties of the hammerers do not end at the battlefield. Many dwarven kings also use their hammers as a high-level police force. They are set to guard particularly valuable locations, like the throne rooms, the king's own residence and their living chambers, and, of course, the treasury vault. And you might think that seems like an awful lot of responsibility to place in the hands of a single organization. After all, if you have one group of bodyguards that's sitting on not only the lord's life, but also pretty much all of the city's valuables, that might inspire some ideas of grandeur amongst the officers of said corps. As an example, you can look at the Roman Praetorian Guards. Now, the Praetorian Guard was a lot of things through its existence. They were watch troops, they were a civil militia of sorts, they were elite battlefield troops, they were a police force, and during part of their existence, they were power brokers at the absolute highest level. There are even examples of the Praetorian Guard simply just flat out killing an emperor, and then unilaterally deciding on the next emperor, even going so far as to simply just announce that, yep, this is the next emperor. You want to argue? We stabbed the last motherfucker who argued with us, so are you entirely sure about that? However, the dwarves are not humans. The dwarves take their oaths far more seriously, and there is virtually nothing a dwarf lord could possibly do to get them to betray him outright. It would have to be something truly outrageous, like walking into the ancestral tombs of their ancestors and pissing all over their graves, or allying with necromancers who raise dwarven deads. They'd have to do something that literally goes against everything it means to be a dwarf. And even then, the hammerer would probably have to think twice about it. And with that, let's end this little video on the dwarf hammerers. A short one today, I know, but trust me, there are good things coming, and they're taking a bit of effort. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.